So, I have been asked to do a review of the different eras in professional wrestling. What was a great era, what was a bad era, matches to watch, moments that define these respective eras. And I guess with the benefit of hindsight, we can also talk about what eras did great things for the business, what eras lost money, etc., etc. Now, my brother has sent me a Disney template reviewing top 10 greatest Disney films, and that's right, 33-year-old, soon to be 34-year-old, is watching Disney review videos on YouTube and asking a 31-year-old to do a review on wrestling. You will be surprised to know that the 33/34-year-old is married and does have children. You won't be surprised to know that the 31-year-old wrestling fan doesn't. He's single and he's on his own. Anyway, the first era we are going to cover is between 1940 to 1985. Now, don't roll your eyes or just turn the whole thing off. Don't worry, I'm not going to be telling you about wrestling matches with Lou Thesz in 1955. It's more so you have a historical understanding about the time period of this era. I was actually contemplating should we include this as an era because, in many ways, it's more of a historical context. But for me, in my opinion, for you to truly appreciate the significance and the power of the other eras that we're going to talk about in other videos, you need to kind of know where it all began. It's like any story. To truly appreciate where you're going, you need to understand where you have came from. Wrestling in 1940, if you had said to them that 80, 90 years later, wrestling's going to be mainstream, it's going to be talked about around the world, it's going to have licensing deals and advertisement deals and TV networks, and wrestlers are going to star in movies, no one would have believed you. Without this era, which I'm going to call the territory era, without the territories, there is no WWE today. Vince McMahon certainly doesn't become the billionaire that he has become. And I'm not sitting here doing this video or being asked to do this video. And in that regard, although I obviously wasn't alive between 1940 and 1985, I should be perhaps the most appreciative of this era because without this, a resident like myself in the United Kingdom probably doesn't later on discover the WWF randomly on TV and doesn't fall in love with it, and it doesn't become such a staple and comfort of my childhood. And in that regard, I'll always kind of be grateful. Um, in 1940, pretty much up to this period, until one man had a vision and an idea and some balls to change things, wrestling was like the circus. People didn't take it seriously, and you could argue people don't take it seriously to this day. But even if you're not a wrestling fan, you could go up to most people in the street and say the name Hulk Hogan, The Rock, Stone Cold, John Cena, and they would know who they are. They would have heard of that name. They would know what they do. My mom can't stand wrestling, but knows the Undertaker, respects his kind of legacy, and knows that I kind of grew up with him, and we wouldn't have had any of that without this state, without this era, without this historical time period. So we're going to cover between 1940 to 1985, but it's going to be a little bit different to the other videos you're going to see because this isn't really a top 10, but it's more 10 historical significance happenings um, to kind of get you prepared and knowledge up to date of where we're at. There's a couple of matches I can recommend, there's a couple of moments, but it's more going to be a top 10 happenings between 1940 to 1985, which I'm calling the Territory Era. I hope you enjoy. Shout out to Lee. Happy birthday. Video number one is up and ready. So let's start by talking about the NWA, believed to have been formed in 1940 and I guess still technically around today. It's kind of had a bit of a relaunch, a bit of a reboot. Some wrestling fans actually getting a bit of a kick out of that. Um, Throughout the 2000s and kind of late 90s, it was around on the kind of territory scene, but it's a shadow, obviously, of what it used to be. This is essentially just going to be a quick run through of what the NWA was. The NWA was a group of promoters who all came together and decided who was going to be their champion. I want you to imagine America, Canada, Mexico, Japan, to a lesser extent, especially at this time, Europe. And imagine, and we'll use America as an example, each city. Each city has got its kind of own wrestling promotion. Some big, some small, some successful, some not, some lasting years and decades, some lasting months. Now, bearing in mind, this is before the internet, before mobile phones, before there was ways to share a message with the world within seconds, before even magazines. I mean, wrestling wasn't even big enough to have magazines at this point. So if you lived in, say, Chicago, what you saw is what you knew. That's all you got. Your roster in Chicago was your roster. Your top baby faces to you were the top baby faces. The main heels were the main heels. You didn't know what was going on in New York or Boston or this great star in Japan. You only knew what was exclusive to you. And you would most likely have to physically go to those events because there was no TV or pay-per-views, etc., etc. So what you had was the promoters would get together and they would vote for who's going to be the champion, who's going to be trusted to travel around America and to an extent travel around the world and represent us as the NWA champion, who's going to go to territories where they're not known and face the local star, and their job would be to, while retaining the championship, make that local talent look like $1 million, make him look like a star. And normally this would be kind of 60-minute Broadways. And that's why champions were few and far between in the NWA, because this was a big deal. This was a big element of trust. You were trusted to travel around the world, be on time, be able to wrestle for 60 minutes, be able to tell a story, be able to go in front of an audience who maybe didn't know you and get that heat and get sympathy for the local star. And of course, there's an element of politics involved because everybody wants their promotion to be the best promotion. So if you were running Chicago, if you were running Florida, if you were running Montreal, ideally you wanted your guy in Montreal to be the champion, because by by association, it makes your brand look better. And I just need to kind of emphasize and really stress this. This is how the wrestling business worked and operated for decades, and people were happy with that. It was a smart way to make a decent living, put food on your family's table without worrying about any competition. I'll use Stu Hart as an example because most of you will be aware of him as a promoter. That was a family run business where he exclusively had the run of Calgary. It was a way to support his family. He would have the wrestlers come to his house. He would train them. He would put them up, get Helen to cook for them. They would sleep there. The Hart family, the sons, the daughters, when they were old enough, drive to the airport, pick them up, drive them around. Even the kids make posters, make signs, make advertisement for the Friday and Saturday shows. And everyone was comfortable with this. Everyone had their own little niche wrestling market, and nobody stood on each other's toes. Until, of course, until. So, I've given you an insight in terms of how the territory works. Take any country, different cities, and they've got their own promotion, their own rosters, and then there's one champion trusted to essentially travel around that country and go in and sell tickets and make everyone in that territory on that roster look better than they were coming in. I mentioned that some promotions were bigger than others, some made more money than others, some stayed around longer than others. Well, in 1960, there was a promotion called the CWC. The CWC had a lot of power, a lot of stroke, and played a lot of politics within the NWA because the CWC was exclusively run kind of in the New York territory, which was always a wrestling hotbed. Because obviously, some cities are going to like wrestling more than others. New York is, to this current day, one of the hardcore wrestling hotbeds. So the CWC had certain power, certain politics, because they had, I guess you could argue, one of, if not the biggest audiences. Now the CWC was originally run by a man called Vincent McMahon Sr. That's right, you might see where I'm going with this. Vince McMahon Sr. would promote wrestling events in New York City, and before that his father Jess McMahon was also a promoter and did events such as boxing. The CWC would have some influence on the NWA. They were very happy when Buddy Rogers, who you may know as the first ever WWF champion, in the 50s, he kind of majority of the time worked for the CWC, and Vincent McMahon Sr. and a partner were very happy when Buddy Rogers was asked to be the NWA champion, because again, by association, if you're elsewhere and it's like, well, who's our NWA champion? Oh, it's this man called Buddy Rogers. Oh, wait, where's he from? Oh, he wrestles for the CWC in New York City. By association, it makes the CWC look legit and almost like, the dominant promotion. The CWC had so much power and so much politics that when it was voted for Buddy Rogers to drop the championship, they weren't happy. And again, on the board, lots of politics are going on. And they're outvoted. Buddy Rogers is going to lose the NWA Championship. And in response, the CWC say, that's fine. We're leaving. We're out. We don't want to be part of the NWA. We don't need you. We've got our fan base. We make money in New York. You need us more than we need you. In other words, we walk away from the NWA. You lose us. You lose New York as a territory. You won't be able to come and wrestle there, because again they kind of had this unwritten rule that you didn't stand on each other's toes. Your territory was your territory, and nobody competed with that. Nobody came into your backyard. So the CWC, led by Vince McMahon Sr., would leave the NWA, would quietly rejoin the NWA. But that's not really important. What is important is for you to know the CWC ran in New York, had a big fan base in New York, realized they had a big fan base in New York, realized they didn't really need the NWA and weren't reliant on the NWA. And who exactly did the CWC go on to become? It's often said you either get wrestling or you just don't understand it. Try explaining to a non-wrestling fan the meaning of being the world champion. It's not actually something you win. It's not something you actually lose. It's simply a writer backstage writes on a piece of paper, this guy's going to be champion, and the promoter either says good idea or bad idea. It's nothing more than a storyline prop, a way to get over a character, a way to sell tickets, to advertise pay-per-views, etc., etc. Something I want you to think about and remember as we go on throughout this series is, for something that's predetermined, for a championship that you don't actually compete for in any way, that you don't win or lose, think how important it is to people. Name the biggest name you can think of: Stone Cold, Bret Hart, Shawn Michaels, and just think about what that championship means to them. Think how they acted when they were asked to lose it. Think about the politics that others have been accused of, Triple H, Hulk Hogan, to be champion. Now, to me, when I hear world champion, the first name that comes to my head is the Nature Boy, Ric Flair. Now, I'm not one of these who thinks Ric Flair is the greatest to ever live. There are wrestling fans who believe that. I respect Ric Flair. I appreciate his charisma, his promos, his conditioning. But I don't think he's one of the greatest. But I do think he probably comes the closest to being a legitimate world champion in wrestling. And that's because what it meant to be the NWA champion was a big deal. Ric Flair was first given that honor in 1981 against the American Dream, Dusty Rhodes, a match that I would recommend you go and watch, and only the beginning of their fantastic rivalry that would go on for a decade. The NWA needed someone they could trust, someone who was going to be away from their family and travel around America and travel to Japan and travel to Mexico and travel to Canada and who could go in there and could be trusted to wrestle 16-minute Broadways and be able to, even in victory, make the local star look like $1 million. Ric Flair could do that because he lived the gimmick. He believed he was the Nature Boy. He really did travel on jets and limousines and have the girls and the Rolex watches and the expensive, ridiculous shoes. And that all came from being trusted in 1981 to be the NWA champion. You even had to put a deposit down when you were asked to be the NWA champion. The NWA needed someone they could trust, someone who was legitimate, and someone who lived it, who generally was going to be a world champion and wrestle around the world and have the best matches in the world and put talent over. So go back to 1981. It's the first of, if you believe, 16 of Ric Flair's world titles, at least officially by the WWE. There's some who might contest that. But go back to 1981 and watch Ric Flair become the face of the NWA. And for a long time, even when the WWE came along, that was the one thing that an old school hardcore wrestling fans would say that WWE didn't have: the credibility, the prestige of the real world champion, the NWA champion, the Nature Boy Ric Flair. His first title, 1981. Go and watch it. If I could woo, I would woo. If you didn't work it out from earlier, Vince McMahon Sr. is, of course, the father of Vince McMahon Jr., and the CWC would later on be renamed, rebranded the WWWF. Well, in 1983, Vince McMahon Sr. decides to sell his territory, to sell his company, his business, whatever you want to call it, and he comes up with a payment plan. And the deal he lines up is he'll sell his promotion, and there would be a bunch of repayment plans, a repayment schedule, quite a generous one, not a lot to pay each month. But the catch is, if the buyer failed to repay him even once, if he missed a payment or ran out of money, he would hand the company back over. Who did he sell it to? None other than his own son, his own flesh and blood, Vince McMahon Jr. And little did the dad realize at that time, in 1982, that selling his business to his son would change the industry, would change the business, would change history, really, the family history. Little did he realize that his son was on the first step of being this entrepreneur, this businessman, this multi-millionaire. He had one more condition, though. Not just did he give his son a generous repayment schedule, which was a handshake, he had a favor, a kind of unwritten rule, an agreement, a kind of handshake. Don't step on other people's toes. In other words, he was another old school promoter who was respected by other promoters, was respected by his peers, had friends who were other promoters, and was another old school promoter who was happy the way the business was, who only knew one way, who was happy to run New York, have no one come in, have no competitors, and just make a healthy living that way. And he wanted his son to simply carry on that business model. He He knew his son had ambitions, he knew his son had some radical ideas, and before he sold the company to his son agreed. Yes, Dad, I'll stay in New York. No, Dad, I won't go into my rivals' backyards. I promise I won't be a competitor. Um, Morally not right what Vince McMahon Jr. would go on to do, but he was about to change professional wrestling forever. So Vince McMahon Jr., I'm now just going to call him Vince McMahon, set out almost immediately with his vision. Um, Most likely he had this vision way before he even brought his dad's company and knew exactly what he was going to do. And what he was going to essentially do was break his promise, break everything that he had promised to his father when setting up and arranging this payment plan. Vince McMahon didn't agree with the territories. He didn't like it. He thought it could be so much more, and almost immediately removed the WWF from the NWA and was going to rely on his fan base in New York, and also was able, and this is crucial, to get television throughout America. And this was taboo. This essentially broke the unwritten rule, the rule that had been in place since 1940, the rule that even his dad had said, do not break. And that is, he was now stepping on other people's toes. He was now taking a massive poo in people's backyards. He was now essentially competing and being a rival. And he would always claim to this present day he was fair. He walked into each and every one of those promoters' offices, looked them in the eye, and he will say, make them a fair offer to buy out their promotion. Almost like, yes, I'm taking your talent, but I'm not doing it for nothing. I'm going to financially compensate you. And to be honest, a lot of these promotions, some agreed and took the money, but the majority will admit that they laughed him out of their office and thought good luck, because to them, and maybe rightfully so, here's this 30-year-old something young cocky New Yorker who knows nothing about wrestling, who's only in this position because of who his dad is and this generous repayment plan. And now he's walking into people's offices brashly telling them everything that's wrong with wrestling, everything that's wrong with how they successfully run their business, and everything that's wrong, and everything that he's going to do better, and what wrestling should be. And they just were like, good luck. And for years, the product that Vince McMahon put on, they laughed at, they put their nose up. They were wrestling. Ric Flair, Harley Race, Ricky Steamboat. What Vince McMahon did, the product he put on, that was something different. So Vince McMahon was laughed at the office, and what would essentially happen years later is when they realized, okay, this guy's vision is working, Vince McMahon would make them another offer, but this time for a lot less money. So what Vince McMahon was able to do, and let's just again go back to the territories, let's use Chicago as an example. He'd go to Chicago, he'd pay some money, talent would go, yeah, I want to work for Vince McMahon because he's on TV, so he can put me on TV every week and I can be seen by the world. And Vince McMahon would be like, yeah, brilliant, I'm happy that you want to kind of work for me, but the only condition is if you work for me, you ain't working for anyone else. This isn't going to be like the territory days. You're not just going to get bookings throughout the country. And wrestlers gambled. They went, yeah, I'll do that because this guy's on national TV. This guy's going to put my face out there. This guy's starting to do merchandise. This guy's clearly got some vision and some ambition. And slowly but surely, you look at someone like the AWA, Vern Gagne. They would lose Hulk Hogan. They would lose Roddy Piper. They would lose Jimmy Snuka. They would lose the Junkyard Dog. Years later, they would, lose Kurt Hennig and wrestlers like this. Vince McMahon had a vision. He wanted to take wrestling, which wasn't considered serious, which people put their nose up, and he wanted to make it mainstream. He wanted to make it entertainment. He wanted it to be something like a legitimate sport or a concert, which you could sell and put thousands of people in arenas, and that you could have on TV, and that could have appeal throughout the world. And the majority of people laughed at him and thought he was crazy and thought he wouldn't last, because you've got to understand there's a lot of exaggerations in the WWE, but the idea that Vince McMahon put everything on the line, that's not an exaggeration. He did. When he started up, he was like, right, I'm going to buy this talent, put them on TV, make money, get that check, buy that promotion. Okay, this WrestleMania is successful, use that money, buy this territory. And it grew and grew and grew and grew. That was part one of his vision. To get talent, to grow the roster, to have that roster exclusive to him, to get away from the NWA and become its own separate entity, to be on TV and to get some media attention. He'd achieved two of them, but how was he going to get media attention? How was he going to turn heads? So Vince McMahon is sitting there and he's got this vision and he's working out what he wants the WWF to look like, and we're going to have our own roster exclusive to everyone else, and we're going to tour around the world and compete with other territories, and we've got this TV deal. But what do I want my face of the WWF to look like? His father, Vincent Kennedy McMahon Sr., was a big fan of Bob Backlund, and that was the face of the WWF when Vince McMahon Sr. was in charge. Bob Backlund had been the WWF champion something like 4 or 5 years, officially the second longest reign in WWF history. But almost immediately, Vince McMahon set out to kind of change what a champion should look like. Bob Backlund, a great talent, a great wrestler, legitimate amateur wrestler, could have great matches with anyone. But this was kind of Vince McMahon's point. What, for example, separated Bob Backlund to a Ric Flair? You could be Bob Backlund. You could be Ric Flair. I could be Dusty Rhodes. I'm not saying they weren't great talent. I'm not saying me or you could have their charisma or cut a promo like a Dusty Rhodes or Ric Flair. But what separated Bob Backlund to champions in other territories? And then Vince McMahon sits down and watches Rocky III. And a certain Terry Bollea gets a bit of media and mainstream reaction for his cameo performance. And of course, Terry Bollea is aka Hulk Hogan. And he didn't get mainstream attention because of his acting prowess or his chemistry with Rocky Balboa, Sylvester Stallone. It was because how he looked. Now, over the years, we take it for granted that these wrestling physiques where you look like a superhero, where you have Superman's body, that wasn't the case in the 80s. I've just named to you Ric Flair and Harley Race and Dusty Rhodes and Bob Backlund, compare their physiques, just their physiques, with Hulk Hogan. Now, for years there would be this debate of who created Hulkamania. Did WWF create Hulkamania, or is everything the WWF WWE become because of Hulk Hogan? And neither is actually true. Hulk Hogan was with Verne Gagne in the AWA, a babyface feuding with, of all people, Bobby the Brain Heenan, which would be a rivalry years later in the WWE. Vince McMahon watched Rocky and he went, that's the guy. That's the guy with the look of what a champion should be. That's the guy that's going to turn heads at an airport. That's the guy that people can't relate to. That's the guy who's larger than life, who doesn't look like your next door neighbor. That's who's going to be the face of my WWF. So the NWA's counter to Hulk Hogan and the WWF really is the Nature Boy Ric Flair. By 1985, the NWA have kind of accepted, and certainly believe a lot more than they did, that this Vince McMahon's legitimate and he's here to stay. And they kind of do a U-turn. They kind of now understand that Vince McMahon's someone, that WWF is the place to be, the place to work, the place where every talent and superstar wants to ply their trade because they can tour the world and be on TV. So Jim Crockett, who's having increasing power in the NWA, a little bit like the CWC used to. Basically, the territories that were left, the few remaining who weren't being bought out by Vince, who at this point were now struggling, kind of realigned and kind of formed together round about 1985, which was a little bit hypocritical because that's what they had laughed Vince McMahon out of the office, but desperate times calls for desperate measure. They now realized that the territory system wasn't working, that they were losing money, that they were losing fans, that they were losing talent, so it made sense to kind of become one. The one thing the WWF didn't have, that they couldn't rival the NWA with, was the actual wrestling. And it's going to sound really bizarre and backwards, but wrestling kind of wasn't important to Vince McMahon. The wrestling aspect took a second step, took a second backseat to entertainment, to presentation, to media, to storylines. So from an in-ring standpoint, WWF couldn't hold a candle to the NWA. I would go as far to say it wouldn't be till WrestleMania 3, which was what, 1988? Ricky Steamboat versus Macho Man at WrestleMania 3, where WWF had a real 5-star classic wrestling match that was simply in-ring, world-class athleticism. That's what the NWA had. That's why for many people it was a dream match, Ric Flair versus Hulk Hogan, because Hulk Hogan was becoming this huge national star. And then Ric Flair over here, out of loyalty, stayed with the NWA. And while not as big a name outside of wrestling, could do what Hulk Hogan couldn't do in the ring. And to your old school traditionalists, your old school wrestling fans, that's what was important. They'd much rather see Ric Flair versus Harley Race, Ric Flair versus Dusty Rhodes, Ric Flair Terry Funk, Ric Flair Ricky Steamboat. They'd much rather see those guys wrestle for 50 minutes, for an hour, and steal the show in, a badly lit, rundown arena than a rubbish Hulk Hogan match in front of thousands of people with pyro and lightning and all these other things. Just want to give you a bit of insight, some historical background on MSG, Madison Square Garden, New York City. We're about to name some iconic moments from this era. Championship matches, Bob Backlund versus the Iron Sheik, and the Iron Sheik versus Hulk Hogan. And both iconic moments happen in Madison Square Garden, which, if there was such a thing as a WWF home turf or home stadium, it would be MSG. And newer fans to the product might realize that every time there's a pay per view or there's a Raw or SmackDown, the company put that extra effort and stress how important that building and that venue is to not just Vince McMahon but the entire McMahon family. You'll hear Triple H talk about it, Stephanie talk about it, and that is legit. When there's house shows, Vince McMahon usually leaves it to his agents, his producers, to arrange house shows and live events, but Madison Square Garden is the one live event that he cares about, that he used to ring Jim Ross up and go, right, head of talent relations, what have you got lined up for MSG? What's your main event? And they would always put something big on, and Vince McMahon would care and stress and, break down the attendance figure because of his dad, of his granddad. As much as he clearly disagreed with his father's vision and went against his father's wishes, he respected his father, he respected his granddad, these two promoters who would promote wrestling and boxing mainly from New York. And fans will know that there's a certain wrestling event we'll talk about that began in Madison Square Garden. Its 10th anniversary of that event that we'll talk about was in Madison Square Garden, and the 20th anniversary was in Madison Square Garden. And it wouldn't surprise me in 2020, or it'll probably be 2021 once the pandemic kind of clears itself, if Vince McMahon's got something lined up his sleeve that when the world says it's alright to have fans back in arenas, if Madison Square Garden wouldn't be the first one to kind of mark the return of wrestling in front of live crowds. You'll hear Bret Hart say, Madison Square Garden is not a church, but it's holy ground. You'll hear many say, if you make it in New York, you can make it anywhere. And that's true, basically because New York City is renowned for having the hardcore of hardcore wrestling fans, but also because what it means to Vince McMahon. Vince McMahon, I believe, has got a star outside of Madison Square Garden on the ground as a kind of tribute to all the events he's promoted there. If Vince McMahon puts you, even in a live event, in the main event of Madison Square Garden, it's a representation in the industry that you've made it to the top of your profession. So Madison Square Garden is a big deal. If you make it in New York, you can make it anywhere. So imagine being Bob Backlund. You've been the face of the WWF for years, the WWF champion for 4 or 5 years. You're Vince McMahon Sr.'s golden goose, the apple of his eye, the face of his company. And within months of someone turning around saying, by the way, his son, who's younger than you, you're now his, that's your boss. Within months, Vince McMahon Jr. hasn't even hid the fact that he wants to take the WWF title, not just away from Bob Backlund, but he doesn't see Bob Backlund as a headliner, as a viable person to kind of compete at the top of the card. Um, we've already spoke about the reasons why that Hulk Hogan had that look, that had that physique. So logically, you could say, do Hulk Hogan versus Bob Backlund. I mean, what a passing of the torch that would be, that you take this young baby face and have him beat the top guy, end a streak of 3 or 4 years. There's two reasons why that never happened, and there never would be Bob Backlund versus Hulk Hogan for the WWF Championship, kind of, on a mainstream level. First, I guess, to protect Bob Backlund, and secondly, because Vince McMahon had a vision of what he wanted Hulk Hogan to be, and it wasn't just, oh, Hulk Hogan looks like Superman. Something that wrestling, even to this day, sometimes do, and I call it cheap heat, especially in 2020, which you probably can't get away with certain things anymore. But a way to get good heat would be to take someone who was anti-American, or even simply a foreigner who was proud of where he came from, and wave his flag. And in front of a very patriotic crowd, you would make it America versus da-da-da. So Vince McMahon thought, instead of Hulk Hogan beating Bob Backlund, let's have the Iron Sheik from Iran, who wasn't scared to, trash America, and to this day, go on YouTube and just type in Iron Sheik shoot, and you'll see him say some outrageous things which kind of blurs reality to fiction, probably because he's old school and he's staying in kayfabe, but to this day he will say some unbelievably controversial things. So Vince McMahon thought, if I had the Iron Sheik as the WWF champion, and he's denouncing America and saying what a rubbish country it is, and Iran #1, and the crowd are getting angry, and the crowd are throwing things at him and chanting USA. What a way to make a baby face. I mean, whoever represents America and brings that WWF championship back to America, oh my God. And essentially that's what he did with Hulk Hogan. Hulk Hogan became Mr. Red, White and Blue. So it was perfect. Iron Sheik beats Bob Backlund, and you can have Iron Sheik as the traditional champion, a way to get the belt to Hogan without furthering angering Bob Backlund. But it's also a way to make Hulk Hogan's first WWF Championship reign as important as ever, because he's representing America now against this despicable heel from Iran, the Iron Sheik. So Iron Sheik would face Bob Backlund in Madison Square Garden, and famously would beat him with the camel clutch, and famously, of course, Backlund never submitted. His manager threw the towel in, and any long-term fans will remember Backlund in 1994. That would be used as a storyline, that Bob Backlund never forgave his manager for throwing in the towel, and technically Bob Backlund's WWE Championship reign ends without him actually submitting. It was a smart way. It was a smart way to protect Bob Backlund, have him injured as a reason of why you're not having Bob Backlund versus Hulk Hogan. And probably at the time, you were leaving yourself open to, yeah, let's write Backlund off TV, and later on down the line, we can have a huge Bob Backlund Hulk Hogan match, babyface versus babyface. That never happened. If you look at the time frame, Vince McMahon buys the WWF in 1992. He has the Iron Sheik then beat Bob Backlund in December of 1983. And then in January of 1984, Hulk Hogan's beating the Iron Sheik. So the Iron Sheik really is the definition of transitional champion. Bob Backlund would then, later on in 1984, leave the company and would actually officially retire and wouldn't return to wrestle again until 10 years in 1994. So just think about that. Here's Bob Backlund, who under Vince McMahon Sr. was the guy, the face of the WWF, and essentially a year after working with Vince McMahon Jr., he's like, no thanks, I'm done. I'm done with wrestling. I don't want to work for you. You don't value me. You don't see me as a viable person. And perhaps nothing emphasizes the change in direction more than that. Vince McMahon buys the company off his dad. One of the first things he does, hire Hulk Hogan, and then within a year, he takes the guy who his dad trusted and basically said, not just am I taking the WWF title off you, you're not going to be in the main events, you're not going to be on last at Madison Square Garden. And the guy who for 4 or 5 years was Vince McMahon Sr.'s champion, within a year of working for Vince McMahon Jr., retires. So let's round off and take you to January 1984, MSG, Madison Square Garden, the Iron Sheik versus Hulk Hogan for the WWF Championship. Not just was this Hulk Hogan's first WWF Championship reign, but it is often viewed as the birth of Hulkamania. Already explained that this was Vince McMahon's vision to make Hulk Hogan Mr. America. That's why Iron Sheik was the champion. That's why he was a champion for just a month. Yes, to be a transitional champion, yes, maybe a few politics were involved. Maybe Vince McMahon was trying to protect Bob Backlund. Maybe he was saving Bob Backlund versus Hulk Hogan for a future date. But it was because of, the gimmick that the Iron Sheik played. It was because he was anti-America and would get heat, making him the perfect person to beat if you're trying to create this Mr. Red, White and Blue character. Hulk Hogan essentially became the kind of, kids, if I can do it, you can do it, brother. As long as you drink your milk and work hard and listen to your teachers and listen to your parents and eat healthy and take your vitamins, you can be anything. Look at me, I'm the American dream. And this was the birth of Hulkamania. And it's Vince McMahon's vision. Vince McMahon saw it. We have to give Hulk Hogan all the credit in the world, because no one even at that time could have envisaged how big that character would become. And that's down to him being the businessman that he is, and probably being the best at kind of listening to the audience and reacting and knowing what was working and living that character and putting that character over to the point where you could probably say there's not a lot of difference between Hulk Hogan the character and Hulk Hogan the person. And that's probably been a problem for him over the last few years. But MSG, January 1984, Hulk Hogan beats the Iron Sheik, and Hulkamania is born. And imagine at this time, you've got Hulk Hogan over here as the WWF champion, and you've got Ric Flair and the likes of Dusty Rhodes and Harley Race over in the NWA, and a Hulk Hogan versus Iron Sheik couldn't hold a candle to, say, Ric Flair, Dusty Rhodes. But Vince McMahon was now showing that in-ring wise, was it important? It was part of it, but you could actually make money by creating proper characters and creating proper storyline and drawing emotion out of fans that way. So I think a perfect way to round off this era, Hulk Hogan beats the Iron Sheik, January 1984, Madison Square Garden, his first WWF Championship. Hulkamania is born at the Mecca, Madison Square Garden. Not a church, but it's holy ground. If you make it in New York, you can make it anywhere. And just think from Vince McMahon's point of view, where his granddad had promoted boxing events, where his father had formed the CWC, he was now back at the same place, Madison Square Garden, where he would have watched his dad as a promoter, having this huge moment of Hulk Hogan becoming Mr. America and creating Hulkamania. And little did anyone envisage just how big a moment this would become.